Vinny! Vinny, look what I got! Vinny! Come help me out! Hey Vincent, the weight of this TV is killing me, man. What you doing? Check out this new LG C7 OLED I've got. Man, the Sony OLED is better. Better motion, better video processing. Nah, Artings.com said that they are very similar in picture quality. In fact, the LG C7 received a higher score. I do know a bit about TVs, you know. Vinny, you're just a presenter and not a very good one. You can't even pronounce 3D properly. You always pronounce it as 3D. Well, you're so busy, you're always on the road calibrating for other people. You don't even have time to sit down and calibrate your own TVs. That hurts deep, man. Real deep. Okay, sorry bro. Apology accepted. There's still one important question though. Wenger in or out? No. Sony A1 or LG C7? Hello everyone, Vinny Teo from HDTV Test here. I'm a professional TV reviewer and calibrator. In this video, we're going to compare the picture quality of Sony's A1 OLED, also known as the Sony A1E in the United States, and the LG C7 OLED TV. Both TVs have been calibrated to the standard used within the film and broadcast industry. For SDR, this means D65 grayscale, 2.4 gamma and Rec 709 color gamut. For HDR, well, HDR10 at least, D65 grayscale, perceptual quantization or PQ-EOTF, and Rec 2020 color signaling. Both the Sony A1 and the LG C7 are connected to the same video sources, including a Panasonic UB900 or Oppo 203 4K Blu-ray player, and satellite broadcast from a Skybox. Disclaimer: unfortunately, we couldn't get our hands on the same screen size, so certain aspects such as panel uniformity and upscaling cannot be compared fairly. I'll explain why later in this video, but by and large, most of our findings should hold true as the definitive head-to-head shootout between the Sony A1 or A1E and the LG C7. The opening intro was already quite long, so let's get right to it. All OLEDs can deliver absolute 0 CDM square blacks, but in the past, the region just above black, especially in lower bitrate or more heavily compressed sources, have been plagued by macro blocking and noise. We played the chapel scene in Skyfall on the LG C7 and the Sony A1, and both TVs did better than the 2016 OLEDs, presenting shadow detail in a cleaner and more stable manner. If we had to pick, the Sony A1 is just marginally cleaner with smooth gradation enabled. It's very marginal. Most people probably won't notice the difference from a normal viewing distance, but we're talking a very high quality, pristine source here. We then played several television episodes that are of a lower bitrate and more heavily compressed from Sky on both TVs. Now, the difference is more noticeable, with the Sony A1 rendering a cleaner picture with less pixelation and posterization, even with smooth gradation disabled. What is interesting though is that the Sony tracks closer to 2.2 or 2.3 gamma just above black, so very dark scenes as a whole look more washed out than the LG C7. The Sony offers a 10-point white balance controls, but it doesn't interpolate very well, especially in the darker shades. What this means is that if we use the 10-point white balance controls to correct the 10% and 20% video stimulus, the TV won't extend the correction to, let's say, 15%. The LG has 21-point white balance controls, and by default, it already tracks closer to 2.4 gamma near black. So, in poorly compressed dark scenes, the Sony A1 is less noisy, but the LG C7 has more depth and dimensionality. We did wonder if Sony engineers purposely coded a brighter gamma near black to 1. Make shadow detail clearer, and 2. To reduce the difference between OLED's native 0 CDM square blacks and the contents above black signal, so that near black quantization errors are less visible. On balance, would probably give a slight edge to LG's implementation. The increase in depth is visible at all distances and for all types of material, whereas the Sony's advantage in cleaner above black handling is really only visible in low bitrate content. Moving on, brightness is the other part of the contrast ratio equation, and contrast performance is the most important determinant of final picture quality. As you can see from this test pattern here, showing a small circle expanding to fill the whole screen, the LG C7 has a less aggressive ABL or automatic brightness limiter overall, so the brighter scenes would look even brighter, even though both TVs have been calibrated to the same peak white luminance using a 10% window test pattern. If you want to calibrate both screens to not have any ABL at all, the Sony is capped at 135 nits, whereas the LG can do 150 nits without ABL, so a slight advantage to the LG there. To be fair, most scenes will look very similar on both TVs because the majority of movies run an APL below 10%, especially if the top and bottom black letterbox bars are taken into account. It's only the brighter scenes with high APL or average picture level, such as a Sky advert with a white background or a clip with plenty of snow, that the LG C7 delivers brighter whites. Okay, panel uniformity. 65-inch OLEDs generally have worse uniformity than 55-inch versions, and that's certainly the case here. On our Sony 65A1 review sample, there are a few vertical bands, one an especially thick one that fortunately cleared up a bit with a manual compensation cycle. Maybe it'll clear up even more with more usage time and compensation cycles. In terms of white uniformity, there's a slight yellow tint 1/3 from the left of the screen on the Sony 65A1, whereas the LG 55C7 is very clean. All we are saying is, we don't think it's fair to compare between a 55-inch and a 65-inch panel for uniformity. Who knows if a 65-inch C7 won't have the same issues. All OLED TVs have some sort of protective mechanism built in to minimize the risk of image retention and screen burn. Both the Sony A1 and the LG C7 have a pixel orbiter function enabled out of the box and will automatically run a routine compensation cycle in standby after 4 hours of accumulated operation. You can also manually trigger a major compensation cycle from the user menu on both sets. However, when a static image outside the Android interface is displayed for a prolonged period of time, the Sony A1 doesn't dim down the screen over time, whereas as you can see from this time-lapse video, the LG clearly does. When not receiving any source signal, the Sony A1 will display a Bravia logo that fades in and out at the bottom left corner, while the LG C7 will run various screensavers. What's different between the sets is that the LG OLED switches itself off fairly quickly if there's no video signal, but the Sony A1 just keeps on going and going until it hits the default idle TV standby limit of 4 hours. We can't judge whose approach is right and whose is wrong since we haven't seen any significant image retention or screen burn on both OLED televisions throughout our review period. What is clear is that LG is more proactive at implementing these anti-screen burn measures. It is difficult to compare the upscaling between different screen sizes because, all else being equal, video content will generally look sharper on a smaller screen, like how videos look pin-sharp on your iPhone but more blurry when blown up on a big TV screen. Nevertheless, when we put up an SMPTE RP133 test pattern in PAL or 576 interlaced, with all unnecessary edge enhancement turned off on both sets, the Sony A1 looked slightly sharper and cleaner with less overshoot and junk pixels. The X1 Extreme chipset is really an excellent piece of technology. Next, motion. With all motion interpolation turned off, panning shots in 24 frames per second movies were presented with equal smoothness on the Sony A1 and the LG C7. I say smoothness, but 24 frames per second is inherently slightly juddery anyway. If you want to smooth out the judder and make things clearer, for example in this chase scene from Planet Earth 2, Sony's motion flow system introduces less artifacts and soap opera effect. The highest motion flow smooth setting on the Sony A1 actually exhibited less artifacts or soap opera effect than the lowest true motion clear setting on the LG C7, although true motion clear is smoother than the motion flow smooth on the A1. The Sony A1 also offers a black frame insertion mode, but we think most users probably won't use it because of flicker. The Sony A1 looks more juddery than the C7 when asked to display a 24 frames per second movie from a 60Hz source, but this is a total non-issue for UK and European viewers because our broadcast is 50Hz in nature, and 4K Blu-ray players generally output 24 frames per second films natively as 24 frames per second to the TV anyway. On the other hand, our OLED C7 sample exhibited occasional deinterlacing artifacts when watching football from a 1080i 50Hz source. This is not a problem for US viewers whose broadcast system operate in 60Hz. Right, let's move on to HDR or high dynamic range. Many people are getting confused here. Several technical reviews have said that the LG OLED can hit a higher peak brightness, and yet in real-life viewing, the specular highlights look darker than the Sony A1. So there's a general consensus that the HDR measurements don't reflect real-world performance. That's partly true, but I want to explain the true reason why the Sony A1 looks brighter even though it measures darker. It's because of different tone mapping approaches between the Sony A1 and the LG C7. When HDR content that's mastered at 1000 nits or even 4000 nits is tone mapped to a display with lower peak brightness, such as OLED TVs that is only capable of maybe 800 nits, a balance has to be struck between brightness and detail. The more highlight detail you want to preserve, the darker the overall image have to be. On the flip side, the brighter you want the overall image to be, the more bright highlight detail you have to throw away. This is known technically as clipping. So the reason the A1 looks brighter than the C7 is because Sony engineers have designed its tone mapping curve to clip above 1000 nits, whereas the LG C7 is trying to retain more detail above 1000 nits, causing the overall HDR picture to appear darker. Here's a test pattern that shows different nit levels. You can see the Sony A1 can still resolve all the detail to 1000 nits in the custom picture preset, but if you use Cinema Pro, the Sony A1 will clip at 800 nits. Let's move on to a pattern that goes up to 2000 nits. You can see the Sony A1 does not try to differentiate between different nit level. It's just rendering all of them in pure white and so will look brighter. The LG C7, on the other hand, is showing all the different nit levels. If we go to the next test pattern, the LG is even trying to resolve detail up to 4000 nits. Let's use some real-life content. I'm playing Batman vs Superman, a 4K Blu-ray that has been graded to 4000 nits. And I'm pausing here on Batfleck's white shirt. Yes, this is now the gold standard for tone mapping. You can see the Sony A1 appearing brighter, but it's blowing out the creases and the seams, whereas they are clearer on the LG C7. Of course, LG's tone mapping has its own downsides. By trying to maintain highlight detail that's coded at 4000 nits, the APL or average picture level has to be lowered, which you can see in this scene which comes later in Batman vs Superman. Don't judge me. Fortunately, the 2017 LG OLEDs have a technology called Active HDR that tries to simulate dynamic metadata from static or even no metadata at all, so you can use it to brighten APL, especially in 4K Blu-rays that are mastered to 4000 nits. Which tone mapping approach is right and which is wrong? To be honest, there's no standard for tone mapping anyway, but because we are video enthusiasts who value accuracy to the source above all else, we probably prefer LG's method, since Sony's method is throwing away some bright highlight detail. Of course, the whole landscape will change again with the arrival of Dolby Vision dynamic metadata system, and maybe that's what Sony is banking on. Otherwise, the Sony A1 is slightly better than the LG C7 in several aspects when we watched a number of 4K Blu-rays. The Sony exhibited less posterization in smooth gradients, such as the sky in The Martian and The Revenant, even without smooth gradation turned on. Also, during the fade-in from black or fade-out to black in The Revenant, the LG C7 showed a really weird rippling effect, as if the TV didn't have enough steps between black and just above black. We've paused this frame that is a fade-out of Leonardo DiCaprio's face. The Sony maintained the full feature of the face, but on the LG, the face is half gone, half severely posterized. The C7 also lacked gradation in rendering this extinguishing flame in the sequence from the 4K Blu-ray of Mad Max Fury Road. On the Sony A1, you can clearly see the sand surrounding and behind the fire, whereas on the LG, the fire itself looks less refined. To be fair, this is only really obvious in Mad Max Fury Road for some reason. We checked out the fire in various other titles, such as The Revenant and The Amazing Spider-Man 2, and the fire looked equal on both TVs. Input lag is lower on the LG C7, 21 milliseconds for both 1080p and 4K signals. On the Sony A1, 4K lag is around 30 milliseconds, but 1080p lag is in the high 40s. For playing 4K games, we don't think the difference in the LG's 21 milliseconds and the Sony's 30 milliseconds is that big, but for 1080p games, the LG C7 will be more responsive. Okay, I hope you found this a fair comparison. The LG C7 and the Sony A1 or A1E are quite close in picture quality once calibrated. Both are fantastic TVs, although one will do some things better than the other and vice versa. The LG C7 or 2017 OLED TVs in general will have more comprehensive calibration controls to achieve more accurate grayscale and a flatter 2.4 gamma near black, less ABL, HLG and Dolby Vision support out of the box without needing future firmware updates, lower input lag, and better preservation of highlight detail in 4K Blu-rays that are mastered to 4000 nits. The Sony A1, on the other hand, will have smoother gradation, less intrusive motion interpolation, even cleaner above black handling of low bitrate content, slightly superior upscaling, and a more refined HDR presentation. Panel uniformity is always going to be a bit of a lottery, particularly in 65-inch screen sizes. If you found this comparison useful, please click the like button and subscribe to the HDTV Test YouTube channel for more videos like this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you the next time.